We have a great show for you today. We're going to discuss the implications that issues from gun violence and abortion to climate change and the war in Gaza have on the 2024 election. We'll also analyze the Biden campaign's strategy to appeal to young voters in this election process, and we'll do it, as always, from an authentic youth perspective. I'm David Seaton.
I'm Dalmas Kazemi.
I'm Marcus Siniceros.
And I'm Mira Baswan.
Mira, do you want to kick us off here?
Yeah, sure. So basically, what we're going to be talking about are Biden's odds of winning this re-election. Right now, I think that Biden's strategy to win is not just necessarily limited to gaining support from his base. It's also to warn people about, in his mind, the threats to democracy, abortion, and other racial, gender, sexuality related infringement of rights that Trump will pose if he's elected. And I think that Biden has definitely been losing support on various topics. Although his stances on abortion have kind of given his party an edge due to the fact that many Democrats are pro-abortion. I do think that certain other criticisms against Biden have been made. I think one of the biggest things is his age. Biden is now 81 years old, and roughly 3/4 of voters believe that he's too old to serve another term effectively. And I think that that's kind of created a lot of doubt, cast a lot of doubt about his candidacy. And I think another big issue is that Biden has been losing a lot of support among his voters, especially among his younger voters. Like, for example, what's going on in Gaza right now, I think that Biden's stance on that and his staunch support for Israel has caused a huge division in his base of Democratic voters, because a lot of them are divided on his viewpoints, and that has definitely made him lose a lot of support. And I think that's also worrying for Biden because Trump, on the other hand, has a very, very strong supporter base. Even with all the allegations against Trump, with everything that he's been accused of in the past, the majority of his supporters do not care about that. They just want him to win. And that's bad because it means that Biden doesn't have as much of a, I guess, strong supporter base as Trump does in this election. If anyone wants to add to that.
I'd like to add a quick thing. Just as proof to what you said, I speak to fellow students and friends of mine, and socially they believe in the same things that Biden does. It's almost like identical, yet they're so unexcited about the race itself and Biden's campaign. And I ask, I'm like, your views are similar, why? And they don't have the best answer, but they say he just does not appeal to us. But at the same time, when I ask, what about other candidates? There's also not anyone that sticks out to them in that sense either. And whenever you look at Trump's young voter base, they are quite energized just because of the entertainment he produces that you mentioned. People don't really care about his policies. It's more his charisma, quote unquote. And people are attracted to that.
Yeah, I want to agree with you all. I think another thing is what's interesting as we see going into the 2024 election, where, goodness, we're not in 2020 anymore. It seems like we were just there, but now we're here 24, is mentioning on the handling of Gaza. According to an NBC News poll, 70% of young voters disapprove of President Biden's support of Israel, and young people think Trump would do a better job of handling the Israel war than President Biden. By 5%, according to a Harvard poll. I don't know what your guys' thoughts on this. It's really interesting to see, is because even when we look back to even 1968, we saw the Vietnam War play out during that time, and we had President Lyndon B. Johnson was president then, and he did not seek re-election, and then we had Richard Nixon have an upset win during that election cycle. It's just interesting to see, is are young voters going to be motivated to show up? As we see, we even saw recently, was it last night, Tuesday night, that there was a recent protest at one of President Biden's rallies where he was really trying to run on abortion, but people are asking themselves is abortion going to be a motivating factor that's going to oversee the war in Gaza to motivate younger voters to get out there?
Yeah, I think it's important to note where Biden had that rally. He held it in Northern Virginia, which is a critical um, part of the country for Joe Biden to win because it's in the suburbs. And
Mm-hmm.
Biden's path to victory on, particularly on the issue of abortion, is in the suburbs, where women have been tracking away from Republicans and to Democrats, specifically on that issue of abortion.
Yeah. I mean, even as we go in and look at some of the things that young voters are very not happy with President Biden. I mean, there are still some amazing things that President Biden and his administration have been able to accomplish. I mean, some people could even say that Biden has been one of the most progressive modern presidents as it relates to policy, passing the Inflation Reduction Act, passing the Marriage for Equality Act, the Respect for Marriage Act. The Inflation Reduction Act was the largest climate investment in American history. And we saw one of the most comprehensive gun reforms that we possibly, this is an interesting one that we're following, we could potentially see him actually pass comprehensive immigration reform, which my memory is clear, that hasn't happened since the 90s. So I don't know. I mean, there are bads and goods as it relates to President Biden, but I mean, we know the good things on climate is the IRA, the Civilian Climate Corps, and the Willow Project. But it's going to be interesting to see what the Biden-Harris campaign strategy is to really engage and motivate voters, young voters particularly, when they are not happy with one particular handling from the Biden administration.
Yeah, just to that point, I think that a lot of the success that Biden has had, particularly on the climate crisis, have been kind of overshadowed by um, more, I don't know how to say this, like eye-catching things like the Willow Project that serve as a reminder that Biden has broken some of his promises that he did run on, like not drilling in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think
Mhm.
you have a problem with young voters where the things that they are seeing on social media around Biden's record are the promises that he has broken, not the promises that he has kept.
Mm-hmm. And that's a
Yeah.
great point.
Mhm.
It's going to be interesting to see how much these issues stick with younger voters, especially as we know in 2020, we were all very, very motivated to get rid of Trump. And it's really interesting to see how the party and even the country has become a little bit divided on is Biden the right person to lead us into what we all rallied behind in 2020?
Yeah, I think if I can add on to that, I think it's a very it's almost like a conundrum because a lot of young voters do feel that Biden has broken a lot of promises, like with the Willow Project, or what's going on in Gaza. I think Biden is facing a lot of pressure because the situation is only getting worse. And a lot of young voters, or even people that I've talked to in my classrooms, my peers, like they feel kind of a sense of disappointment about these promises that have been broken, and they expected a different response to many of these scenarios. But I think that the problem is that the response is to not vote for Biden at all. But if we're looking at the other alternative, with Trump, for instance, a lot of these social issues that Biden is being criticized for, I personally feel like Trump would almost do the same thing, if not even worse. So it's like when you don't vote at all, it's like every vote towards Trump almost counts more. So that kind of puts us in a difficult situation because it's like a lot of voters don't want to vote for Biden, but then they don't want to vote for Trump either. So they just abstain from voting at all. And that can also be an issue. So,
I completely agree with that. I think that the question for Biden and his team is going to be what kind of voters do they care most about appealing to in this process? do they care about winning back young voters and voters of color who were Biden's base in 2020? Or do they care more about establishing or reestablishing the coalition that elected Democrats in 2022, the suburban women, the people who were tired of Republican extremism? And I think that there is a way to do both. You know, supporting a ceasefire in Gaza is widely popular according to polls. Um, so I think that could be a step that Biden could take, and it wouldn't cost him a lot of support. Uh, but I think that largely Biden's problem with young voters right now is a messaging problem more than a policy problem.
I was going to say the same thing. If they narrow their focus just a bit more on their specific audiences, such as young people who are active in politics, things would be much different. But just as much, personally, when I look into the campaign, I don't see much of that happening right now. That's might be incredibly appealing to the average young person, in college who is somewhat active in politics. And if that were even a bit different, I think we'd be seeing different numbers.
I agree with that. It is a messaging problem. I think going into 2023, President Biden had a really strong campaign with young voters. He did the Vice President Harris did the college tour, which he came to a variety of states, battleground states, and talked to college students about issues that they cared about. And I believe that really motivated a lot of younger people to be a little bit more engaged, especially as we talk about college educated younger voters supporting the Biden Harris campaign. But I think the war in Gaza really, and the thing is, like, Gen Z is a generation of humanitarian, like we humanitarian love. And we do not want to see innocent civilians in any part of the world. We don't care what country it is, we don't care who it is. We just don't want to see innocent children, innocent people be murdered and supported by a war machine that we know that America is, that we know that it is, and we have funneled billions of dollars into the wars throughout the world. And I think it's something that the Biden Harris campaign is really going to struggle with. But another thing is, like, what are we doing to see not just the Biden Harris campaign, but what is Biden Harris doing to engage younger elected officials who are already in elected office to aspire other young people to be more engaged? Because, we have Congressman Maxwell Alejandro Frost, who was really great in helping President Biden with the March for Our Lives movement and for the gun safety bills. So what is the Biden Harris campaign doing to engage the more progressive wing of the party, to engage young organizers and voters to rally back around the Biden Harris campaign? So I think it's going to be a very interesting, but I agree with you. Every vote that does not go towards Biden, and even when we look back at Nikki Haley, a quarter or half of Nikki Haley supporters will support Biden over Trump. And it's going to be a matter of a turnout game. So we're going to have to see who is going to show up. And we have to also recognize, people, that millennials and Gen Z make up half of the voter block. This is the first election cycle that we make up half of the voting block. And we are a generation that has to be listened to.
Yeah, just to back up what you said, I think one of the things that the Biden campaign could do, if they are seeing that this election is uh, going to be a choice for a lot of people between the best of two evils, is to make abundantly clear to voters that just because the presidential race is that way, it does not mean that every other down ballot race is the same way. Maybe you have a Gen Z congressperson running for office. I would love to see more of them.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to get people motivated by other races other than the presidency.
I agree with that, David. 100%.
I think also, going back to some of the things that Biden has done well, I think there's also like a general misconception if we're talking about Biden versus Republicans, specifically Trump. There's been like a general misconception that by many people that Trump would handle the economy better, or that when it comes to money and taxes, that the Republican Party would be better alternative. But I think that a lot of people are just unaware of some of the, like we had said earlier, some of the positive kind of policies and actions that the Biden administration has put through, like with Biden's presidential reign, the US now has like among the lowest inflation rates in the world, and we avoided an economic recession that was brought by COVID-19. So I definitely think that um, along with kind of the social issues like abortion rights and that kind of realm of things, there definitely is less awareness of kind of the positives of Biden's economic policies, especially I think among young people, because we often do focus on social issues, which are very, very important. But I do think that perhaps less young voters are aware of these economic policies that Biden has put through.
Yeah, and I think that one of the reasons why that is because that Trump was incredibly lucky to preside over a country and a world at a very, very productive economic time, um, somewhat attributable to the Obama administration's work, and until COVID. And Biden, for his entire presidency, I mean, he was inaugurated during a global pandemic, and ever since then, he has been faced with crisis after crisis after
Hmm.
crisis after crisis.
Mhm.
So if you are not paying attention, if you are not consuming news, and or if you are consuming news through social media that is overwhelmingly negative, you are seeing a world that seems to be falling apart. And then you see who's in power. And if
Yeah.
that person is Joe Biden, then it's a very logical thing for a lot of voters to attribute the world's negative state to the president of the United States. And people look back now on, I think, all sides of the political aisle in the US and see Trump's presidency um, as somewhat of like a fond memory. But we have to remember that we have to see Trump's presidency not in the context of 4 to 6 years ago, but in the context of today and say, okay, what are his policies going to be like if they are reintroduced now? What is his policy on Israel? What is his policy on climate? What is his policy on healthcare? Consider that in a lens of today, not 4 years ago.
Yeah, something worrisome that I've seen that's basically just what you said is I personally don't have TikTok, but I did go on one of my friends just to check out what kind of political content is on there. And people don't find economic policy that Biden has uninteresting. So they don't put anything like
Hmm.
that, kind of like what Mira said. It's all just, oh, conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory. And people find it interesting. It's not like these people are in the corners, spreading these things. It's like large amount of people. And it's just pretty hard to see how, you can win when young people apparently are very attracted to these kind of interesting or hidden theories or whatever nonsense. But yeah, unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, Trump's presidency, like you said, kind of like a funny, interesting, appealing thing that people like to look at, whether they are conservative or not.
Yeah, and I think what you said also kind of relates to just social media as a whole. I mean, I definitely think that Instagram and TikTok, they have a lot of positive aspects when it comes to spreading awareness about issues like with Black Lives Matter or um, other kind of issues, but there is definitely an issue of misinformation sometimes, or just like info that hasn't been properly verified on both sides, whether it's supporting Biden or supporting Trump. And I think that when misinformation is circulated, that also causes a lot of controversy, or it can cause people to make misconceptions about certain political candidates. So that's definitely an interesting issue as well that I think has played a role in how Trump is perceived or how Biden is perceived. Because if somebody says something about Trump that's false, but that perhaps makes people appeal to him, I think a lot of people don't fact check what they're looking at. They'll just see that video or they'll see that post and then they'll have their mind set on something. And that's harmful and dangerous because it means that basically anything could be spread on social media. And if people don't take the time to verify it, then their viewpoints are also being kind of warped by that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think we should talk about gun violence. Over the past 4 years, there have been far too many mass shootings across the United States, and this is a problem that is in many ways unique to the United States, and it is disproportionately affecting young people. And young people are taking action by organizing with March for Our Lives, with supporting candidates that prioritize common sense gun laws. And um, right now, what we've seen is that on gun violence, roughly 64% of young people support common sense gun laws, support strengthening laws protecting our generation from guns. And as Marcus said, over the course of Biden's presidency, he's established an office of gun violence prevention led by Congressman Maxwell Frost, part of Gen Z. And he's also passed the Safer Communities Act, which gives incentives for states to adopt red flag laws where they, I guess, track people who are uh, gun abusers. And it closed what's called the boyfriend loophole, which would allow domestic abusers who are not in a married relationship to have their guns removed if they posed a threat to domestic violence victims. Do we think that Biden's message on gun violence is getting through to people, especially in our generation?
Oh my goodness. What a topic. I think the Biden administration, Harris, as we know, we have to also give Biden a little credit here. Biden came into a very divided country. He came into one of the most outrageous pandemics that the country has ever seen in modern times. And he also came with a divided Congress. You know, Democrats controlled the House, but they barely controlled the Senate. It was a divided Senate. And, you know, my amazing, I wouldn't say amazing, take that back, but, my former Democratic and now in Lone Star Independent, Kirsten Sinema, was, as much as I don't even like her, have to give her some tiny bit of credit in her work on the Bipartisan Safer Acts community and the work on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment Act, which was her bill. But I don't know if it's getting across to people. I think a lot of the measures that passed in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act were very things that should have happened 20, 30 years ago. So it wasn't really band-aids. It was kind of more band-aid solutions rather than like banning AR-15s, which we know are one of the highest causes of mass shootings in America. And I think the messaging on that is not the best. I agree with you on David too, that the Biden-Harris campaign has a problem with messaging to younger voters. I don't think it's been getting out there effectively to younger voters, but I don't know. What's your guys' take?
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think that this is really getting out to younger voters just based on what I've observed. Um, as a college level student, I mean, yeah, I think that the Biden administration definitely has been lacking on appealing to young voters, on messaging to young voters, just kind of making them aware of some of these policies because yeah, I don't think it's something that's really been discussed or even like known among this demographic.
Yeah, I also haven't seen anything particularly like, where I would imagine young people would say, yes, that is the solution, or that is at least a big step in the right direction. Nothing so big like that. There have been steps, but nothing that eye-catching.
Yeah, and I mean, some things like incentivizing red flag laws are not insignificant, but they are, as you said, Delnaz, like not sexy. They're not eye-catching. They're not things that young people will be posting about on social media. Like I mean, I don't think I'm pretty politically active person, and I'm not going to post about, my state was incentivized to enact a red flag law. That's just not interesting to a lot of people. Um, what do you think that the Biden administration could do to improve their messaging to our generation around these issues?
By that, do you mean like this, like specifically, like gun violence or like the economy or just in general?
I I was talking about gun violence. We can talk about
Okay.
these things. I think that definitely meeting young people where they are is very important. Um, I know that there are some problems right now with politicians using TikTok because it is owned by a Chinese company, and there are some issues with that. But as we know, TikTok is a place where a lot of Gen Z gets information for good or for bad. And having a greater presence on TikTok would certainly lead to some of these actions reaching more of our generation.
No, I definitely agree with you, David. I think this is another issue that also brings light to the fact that America is just even add to light. America has the oldest leaders and leadership that we've ever had in American history. Just to add also in time, the Senate Majority Leader is the House Speaker. Well, not anymore, but the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, has been leader of the Republican caucus in the Senate for years, and President Biden is the oldest president. Um, it just kind of shows just a little bit of how out of touch older leaders are as it relates to young voters, and also goes back to what is the strategy for engaging younger leaders that are in office, even though there's few, but there is some out there, and what are they doing to really empower those other young leaders to therefore inspire young voters like ourselves to be more engaged in their campaigns and in the processes. But there is a generational divide in America between Gen Z and the boomers, even that are still in power, and Gen X's. And I think it is something that we really do have to address by supporting other younger leaders who are trying to step up and run for office, because this is the oldest Congress and the oldest presidency that we've ever had in American history.
Yeah, I think one interesting kind of counterpoint to that is I think Chuck Schumer's advocacy on the issue of student loans. He was
Mm-hmm.
perhaps the largest reason why Biden had came out with the plan that he originally did around forgiving student loan debt. Uh, after, and I think it's because he knows the importance of appealing to young voters, especially in his state of New York. I think something that was a challenge for that, for the promotion of that plan, was how muddied the waters got when the court overturned Biden's original student loan forgiveness program. He did recommit to offering student loan forgiveness for borrowers in the US, and he recently forgave millions of dollars of debt. But the promotion of that, again, has not been adequate to our generation. And I'll ask again, how do we think that the Biden administration could be doing better in that area?
So I know you mentioned using TikTok as a tool. That actually this might be a bit unrelated because it relates to Canadian politics, but it reminded me of Jagmeet Singh, who is the leader of the NDP party in Canada, and he, I think, I mean, his main competition was, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, and I think he kind of set himself apart by using TikTok, and he has like a very large following, and I think that's also definitely influenced young people's views towards him, even if it's more so out of like curiosity, because this is the first time that they're seeing a major like uh candidate for prime minister on such a youth dominated platform. So I do think that um using social media could definitely be a strategy, and it doesn't necessarily have to be TikTok. Like, I know that, for instance, Vivek Ramaswamy had used Instagram a lot in his kind of garnering for support, and I do think that it definitely did help at least a bit to attract young people, because I think our generation, Generation Z, even millennials, like, we spend a lot of time on Instagram. And if we can bring this information, if we can bring these kind of positive aspects of Biden's administration straight to the source of young people's news, because I think we can agree that a lot of young people do kind of go to Instagram for news. So maybe if we kind of, well, not us personally, but if the Biden administration kind of put more of an emphasis on bringing these statistics, bringing this information to Instagram, then that definitely would, I think, attract the attention of more young people.
Yeah, not to repeat exactly what you said, but definitely utilizing all social media, but TikTok as well. I know I mentioned TikTok in a negative way before, but it will definitely be helpful in this regard. And I noticed with this issue of student loans, a lot of not older people, but people kind of in between boomers and Gen Z had gotten excited that the issue was being even addressed. Millennials and even Gen X individuals who may have gone to school and still have debt. But I think this has a great opportunity to be appealing to Gen Z now that many of us are in college, graduated, or are going into college. It's almost the perfect issue to appeal to people of this generation.
Yeah, and there's no age um to not there's no age that's kind of too old to appeal to Gen Z. And I think that it's a matter of trying more than it's a matter of, just like putting a young person in an ad saying, Biden did all this great stuff. I think if I'm not expecting Joe Biden to show up on a TikTok video, but if there were some kind of more Instagram ads that targeted young people, even just with Joe Biden talking about it, I think that could be something that could help, at least a little bit. Let's shift the conversation to talking a little bit about the wider electorate and one issue in particular that is going to be front and center in this election campaign, the issue of immigration. I don't know about you all, but in my circles of youth, I have not really found a lot of young people that are as motivated around the issue of immigration as older voters are. What have you all found?
I mean, I would say that in my experience, I think a lot of young people who are interested in the topic of immigration would want to advocate for more open borders. Because again, I think Marcus had said, like, Gen Z is very passionate about, social equality, bringing more opportunities to people, and especially with kind of the displacement of individuals in various parts of the world. I mean, I think that it's a very common view that a lot of young people agree on, that immigration should be allowed, whereas with, I think, perhaps older voters, I think there might be a lot of kind of hesitancy around that, and perhaps more older voters want more closed borders because they have this viewpoint of, America as a country and not wanting to take in too many people from foreign countries. So I think that is an issue that is also a bit like, there is a divide between generations when it comes to immigration, because I'd say that depending on the age of voters, a lot of them have different viewpoints, even within, like, if we're talking about like Democrats, I think even other Democrats who might be older might not be too enthusiastic about opening up more immigration. So
And I think that, just to back you up there, I think the fundamental argument against increasing the number of immigrants in our country is to keep things the way they were decades ago. And the one generation that is able to make that argument in good faith is older people who actually had experience decades ago in our country. So by nature, this is going to be a topic, immigration and the border, that appeals to older people at a higher extent.
I do think that the older generation definitely has that prevailing viewpoint. And although maybe the younger generation hasn't actually witnessed what it's been like in the past, I think that their main argument to opening up immigration is that a lot that would only improve the economy because it would open up more jobs and um, businesses would thrive, or the cost of, even if we're talking about like labor, the labor market would increase as well. So I think that there's kind of different ways of looking at it. There's definitely some validity behind both kind of arguments, but yeah, I do think that that is something that maybe isn't discussed as much among younger audiences, although I do think that that would be an issue that would appeal to our generation because it ties into a lot of issues that we are kind of interested in as well. So I think that would be something that young voters would want to hear more about, or would want to kind of, just know more information regarding that.
What's interesting that you mentioned it could be tied to other topics that young people are interested in already. I was just going to say, immigration isn't kind of on its own. It could also be considered some sort of a social topic or policy because humanitarian treatment goes into it big time, especially with what we've seen recently. And it is quite surprising that young people aren't on top of it as much as abortion, for example. Not saying one is more important than the other, but it isn't as loud, I guess, the topic as a whole when it comes to young people. It's just interesting to me since, as you said, could be tied together with other issues.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why that is because Democrats have been terrified to talk about immigration at all for the past, ever since Trump came onto the stage, because they have been told by people who have been in politics for, I don't want to say too long, but that's kind of what I mean, that immigration isn't only a Republican issue, and that if you don't have a conservative opinion on the border or immigration, that you will lose voters. And I think we have to ask as a generation the question of what voters do you care about? Because if you are only caring about voters over the age of maybe 60 or 50, that could be the case, that a conservative lens on immigration is the most appealing. But if you are concerning Gen Z, then we are demanding that Democrats and Republicans come to the table and tackle this issue as the humanitarian crisis that it is.
I was just going to say, with you saying that it's not the smartest move to have, to think just about voters above 50. Of course it isn't. But do you think that may be due to the lack of faith in young people to show up at the polls, since young people apparently are so terrible at voting, even though they could make a huge difference? Do you think that may be the reason why it's just they're not bothering?
Yeah, I think it's a domino effect. It's young people don't show up. So we don't elect politicians that are going to appeal to us. And then politicians that don't appeal to us feel less inclined to support our stances on issues because they believe that we won't hold them accountable.
Very well put. Yep.
So I think the only way we can break that cycle is not to expect politicians to somehow come to their senses and recognize our generation for the political powerhouse that we are, but to start demanding, well, to keep demanding that our politicians are accountable to the issues that our generation is prioritizing and the way we see issues that are in the conversation right now.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I mean, our generation is going to be the future, like our future politicians and change makers. And I think that like we hold a lot of power and a lot of influence, and the decisions that young people make can shape the future of the elections. And I think that we want to move towards engaging young people more, because I think there's starting to become like this sort of kind of detachment is starting to form. Like people no longer want to, they don't have support for any candidate in a lot of cases. And it's like when you kind of detach yourself from the situation and act as though like, you know, you're not part of it, that just that just means that, you know, your potential kind of impact is being taken away, and you could make an impact. So I think just like having the younger generation being more engaged and just like brought back into these conversations, prioritizing young voices more is very important. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us here on Pod Save the Youth today. We were very lucky to have most of our panel for most of the conversation, and we will see you all next week here on Pod Save the Youth. I'm David Seaton.
I'm Marcus Siniceros.
I'm Mira Swan.
And I'm Delmas Kazemi.